The Mexican War from 1846 to 1848 pitted the United States against Mexico. This was largely due to the Texas annexation issue in 1845. On February 2, 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed to end the Mexican War between the United States and Mexico and grant the U.S. control of land stretching to the Pacific Ocean. The treaty essentially ended the war and expanded the territory of the United States across the continent, encompassing what would later become the states of Texas, California, Nevada, Utah, most of New Mexico and Arizona, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. Welcome back to Comparison World Facts, and today we're going to unravel the Mexican-American War. Did you know that disease was the most prominent cause of death for American troops? What developments from this war over 150 years ago are still plaguing us to this day? Keep watching along closely. We've got everything you need to know coming right up. Also, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. We don't want you to miss out on any of our content just like this. First, how did it all begin? In 1844, President James K. Polk ran on a Democratic platform and advocated manifest destiny, the notion that Americans were predestined to colonize the entire North American continent. In 1844, John Tyler had negotiated a treaty to annex the Republic of Texas on behalf of the U.S., which was later actualized by President Polk, who wanted to control California, New Mexico, and land close to the disputed southern border of Texas, and wanted Mexico to sell the U.S. these territories. So John Slidell, an American diplomat, was sent to Mexico City in an attempt to buy the land. However, the Mexican government rebuffed his offer of $30 million and wouldn't even meet with Slidell. Polk, who was desperate to acquire the land, would go on to send American troops to Texas in January 1846 in order to provoke a war. On April 25, 1846, Mexican troops opened fire against the American forces, prompting Polk to declare that Mexico had invaded U.S. territory and committed American bloodshed. Polk consequently sent an order for the war to Congress on May 11 of 1846. The act was considered controversial. Many Northerners felt Polk, who was a Southerner, was trying to gain land for the slaveholding South, and other Americans simply believed that it was immoral to seize Mexico by war. Keep watching along closely. We've got everything you need to know about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo coming right up. We don't want you to miss out on it. Up next, what happened when the U.S. Army advanced into Mexico? As we mentioned, on April 25, 1846, Mexican cavalry attacked a group of U.S. soldiers in the disputed zone under the command of General Zachary Taylor, killing about a dozen. And with the help of more powerful weapons as well as artillery, the U.S. forces were able to defeat the Mexicans at the Battle of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma. On May 13th, after the battles, Polk informed the U.S. Congress that the cup of forbearances has been exhausted, even before Mexico crossed the line of the United States and shed American blood on American soil. Despite some Northern congressmen opposing it, Congress declared war 2 days later. Only about 75,000 Mexican citizens lived north of the Rio Grande at that time, so Stephen Watts Kearny and Robert Field Stockton of the U.S. Army were able to conquer these lands with very little resistance. Likewise, Taylor had little trouble advancing, and he and his men eventually captured Monterrey in September, the charismatic strongman who had been living in exile in Cuba. Santa Anna convinced Polk that he would enter the war on the U.S.'s terms if permitted to return to Mexico, but he had lied and took control of the Mexican army and led them into battle. Later, in February 1847, at the Battle of Buena Vista, Lopez suffered heavy casualties and had to withdraw from the battlefield, despite having gained control of the Mexican army. Even though Lopez was defeated, he took over the Mexican presidency just a month after the battle. The U.S. troops, led by General Winfield Scott, landed in Veracruz and seized it, then began heading towards Mexico City, essentially following the same route as Hernán Cortés did when he invaded the Aztec Empire, likely because this was such a strategically sound route. Though the Mexicans resisted at the Battle of Cerro Gordo and elsewhere, they were finally defeated. In September 1847, Scott successfully besieged Mexico City's Chapultepec Castle, during which a group of military school cadets dubbed the Niños Heros allegedly committed suicide rather than surrender. So, what was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo? In September 1847, the Mexican government surrendered to the United States after its army was defeated and Mexico City fell, agreeing to end the war. To negotiate the peace, General Winfield Scott acted as a diplomat along with Chief Clerk Nicholas Trist. Scott accompanied Trist as President Polk's delegate. After Trist and General Scott failed twice to negotiate a treaty with Mexico, they realized that they must treat Mexico as a defeated enemy. The then-fallen Mexican government was represented by Don Bernardo Cueto, Don Miguel Atrastain, and Don Luis Gonzaga Cuevas in negotiations with Nicholas Trist. Trist was recalled to Washington to join a Mexican delegation for negotiations, so he missed the delivery of President Polk's message. In the 6 weeks it took to deliver Polk's message, Trist learned from Mexican officials that the Mexican government had named a special commission to negotiate. In the face of Polk's recall, Trist defied the president and reached the treaty. He informed his wife, knowing it to be the last chance, and impressed with the dreadful consequences of losing that chance, I decided today at noon to attempt to make a treaty. The decision is entirely mine. Trist chose to disobey a recall instruction and negotiate a treaty in violation of his instructions, even though he knew that his defiance would cost him his career. The Trist Treaty was negotiated by ceding Upper California and New Mexico to the United States. This was known as the Mexican Cessation and encompassed Arizona, Nevada, and parts of Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico. In addition, Mexico gave up all claims to Texas and agreed that the Rio Grande was the southern boundary with the United States. In return for the extension of its boundaries, the United States paid Mexico $15 million and agreed to pay American citizens debts owed to them by the Mexican government. Additionally, the United States promised to police its boundaries and sought to force future disputes between them to be resolved by arbitration. Trist sent a copy to Washington as soon as possible, forcing Polk to decide whether to repudiate the exquisite work of his inept subordinate. Finally, Polk sent the treaty to the Senate. On March 10, 1848, the treaty was eventually ratified by a vote of 34 to 14. As a result, the United States withdrew its troops from the Mexico capital. On December 30, 1853, the Gadsden Purchase added 47 boundary markers to the original 6 and altered the border from the initial one. Only a few of the markers were likely to endure the weather and were with proper inscriptions, while the majority were just piles of stones. The markers became harder to locate as time went on, and neither country knew for sure where they were anymore. In the 1880s, a convention between the two countries was reached, and a survey was held to verify the need for clear demarcation of the border. The International Boundary Committee was set up to relocate the monuments and draw the line. The U.S. sanction made use of a photographer to photograph each monument positioned and built by them. Keep watching along closely. We don't want you to miss out on everything you need to know about whether the rules of war were followed in this war or not. We've got some exciting information coming right up. Up next, how did disease play a factor in the war? American and Mexican soldiers had one thing in common during the war: suffering from disease. The suffering from disease was exceedingly terrible for the U.S. 7 times as many soldiers were killed by illness as combat during the war, so General Winfield Scott figured out that timing his assault on Veracruz to avoid the yellow fever season would save lots of soldiers from dying from dysentery, malaria, measles, diarrhea, cholera, and smallpox. These were just a few diseases that soldiers suffered from, and brandy, mustard, opium, and lead were used to cure them. Unfortunately, it was actually very frequent for the improvised treatments to be what would turn minor wounds into life-threatening ones. During the Mexican-American War, the United States lost 1,192 soldiers in battle, 362 because of injuries received, and 11,155 due to disease. It's no wonder then that in planning his campaign, Scott avoided increasing the size of his casualty list for his unseen enemies. Camp pollution was the most significant error committed by U.S. forces in the Mexican-American War. The indifference of line officers and recruits to the need of proper sanitation and military hygiene fueled the dysentery outbreaks, and the poor conditions in military hospitals contributed further to the spread of disease. This defect in military culture undermined the health of the Army and led to medical disaster. In addition, disease caused an enormous drain on the U.S. Army's resources, eroded troop morale, and influenced strategy and tactics. As we enter the 21st century, dysentery is still a significant public health threat, killing hundreds of thousands of people annually, primarily children in developing countries where personal hygiene is poor and disposal of human and animal waste is indiscriminate. So, were the rules of war followed in the Mexican-American War? At the start of the war, U.S. troops led by Zachary Taylor adhered to the rules of war for the most part, and almost exclusively battled the enemy. A wave of American reinforcements entered the region in June 1846, which is when robberies of local farms started to occur. As a result, American soldiers committed crimes against civilians, including robbery, rape, and murder in an attempt to relieve their boredom. The wave of criminal activity resulted in American soldiers murdering at least 20 civilians in the first month of occupation, as well as a wave of other crimes against civilians by soldiers. Taylor initially showed little concern for the crimes soldiers were committing and failed to discipline soldiers who committed them or come up with ways to stop them. But as a result, American soldiers lost public support, and Mexican guerrilla bands composed of civilians began attacking patrols of U.S. troops in more significant numbers. Captain Samuel Hamilton Walker and 12 of his Texas Ranger comrades were killed in a skirmish with the Mexican forces. Later, Brigadier General Joseph Lane's troops were ordered to sack the Mexican village of Huamantla after the Rangers were killed to avenge them. After raiding a liquor store, Lane's troops became intoxicated and began attacking the townspeople, killing several Mexican civilians before burning their houses. However, these reports of an American rampage were overshadowed by the news of General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna's resignation after the Huamantla attack. This led to no repercussions against Lane or any of the soldiers involved. The St. Patrick's Battalion, composed of U.S. soldiers who defected to the Mexican Army, was led by John Riley. Up next, what effects does this war still have on us today? Well, if you live in the United States, the effects of the Civil War could be blamed in part at least on the Mexican-American War. In 1841, Ralph Waldo Emerson prophesied that the United States would be fatally polluted by Mexico. Well, slavery became a hot-button issue following the Mexican-American War as a part of the territorial expansion of the United States, and the vast amount of land acquired as a result created divisions in party alliances and increased sectional alliances. The impact on the discussion of slavery had lasting repercussions. Tensions had never been higher, and secession was openly discussed, which over the course of the 1850s increased. With the election of 1860 and ultimately the Civil War, in which brothers fought against brothers, all of these tensions and issues would be realized. To say then that the war with Mexico poisoned the United States was an understatement, because the Civil War was one of the most bloody American conflicts ever fought, and we're still working through the consequences of it over 150 years later. Another major effect of the war is that Mexico lost 55% of its territory. What if, for some reason, this never happened? Would Mexico be a global superpower? In theory, they could have had the oil from Texas, the gold from California, along with the populations and resources from other territories given up to the U.S. If somehow the war hadn't been lost, perhaps we would be seeing Mexico as a global superpower now instead of the U.S. What were some interesting facts about the war? Did you know that Abraham Lincoln was one of the war's harshest critics? Lincoln condemned Polk as a craven military glutton seeking political glory. Lincoln's reputation among his pro-war constituents was harmed by his spot resolutions, and one Illinois newspaper even labeled him as the Benedict Arnold of our district. A large-scale anti-war movement formed as a result of the invasion of Mexico. Because the conflict was one of the first to spark a mass anti-war movement, it attracted a lot of political opposition. Lincoln, a freshman congressman from Illinois, rose to the House floor in 1847 and demanded to know the location of the site where the initial skirmish of the war occurred, saying Mr. Polk's war was a shameless land grab. As an abolitionist, Lincoln claimed that Polk had seen it as a cunning way to add slave states to the Union. Further, did you know that the U.S. military's first large-scale amphibious assault was in this war? Lastly, how did Texas's debt play a part in causing the war? The Republic of Texas incurred an enormous amount of debt to American bankers. Texas declared independence from Mexico in 1835, but was forced to borrow money from American, European, and particularly British banks to pay its bills. In 1844, however, bankers thought the state was full of rich cottonland, but Texas could never pay back all the money its government had borrowed from bankers. In addition, the Mexican government refused to acknowledge Texas's independence and was attempting to reintegrate it into the country. And if Mexico conquered Texas, the European banks would never be able to get their money out of their loans. Another worry of American bankers was that the British or French governments would seize Texas to pay their own bank debts. And there you have it, everything you needed to know about the Mexican-American War. Comment your thoughts on what Mexico would be like if it hadn't lost a whopping 55% of its land during this war. Also, don't forget to like the video as well as subscribe. We don't want you to miss out on any of our content just like this.